Mohammed Bahareth, who is dyslexic, is an author, entrepreneur, and the founder of the Dyslexia Awareness Initiative in Saudi Arabia. Dr. Matthias Grunke is a full professor of special education at the University of Cologne in Germany and a visiting professor at the University of Sunderland in England. He is also the immediate past president of Learning Disabilities Worldwide, the premier international professional organization dedicated to improving the educational, professional, and personal outcomes for individuals with learning disabilities and other related disorders. Dr. George J. Haggerty is the president of Beacon College, America's first accredited baccalaureate institution dedicated to educating neurodivergent students. Prior to Beacon, he served as the Chief of Compliance and Enforcement in the Office of Special Education Programs in the U.S. Department of Education. Peju Name is founder and director of the Pitanga Resource and Special Educational Needs Learning Center in Angola, Africa. A British qualified teacher and SEN consultant with a postgraduate diploma in severe, profound, and complex learning difficulties and disabilities, she has over 30 years teaching and SENCO experience in schools across the UK and Africa. So to kick off our conversation, I want to hear from each of you about the efforts you're doing to advance neurodiversity. And we'd like to start the conversation this morning with Mohammed.
Hello, Daryl. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
We started the Dyslexia Awareness Initiative back in 2016. It started with a TEDx seminar, and when people attended, we found out that the surveys that they delivered to us, nobody knew about dyslexia. From every 100%, just one or two knew about dyslexia. So we started the awareness program, and until today, dyslexia was just classified in Saudi Arabia for adults in 2021 in September, and now both children and adults can get the certification for disability, the legal papers. Also, there is a new government entity formed a few years back, and now they're making workshops. They have invited everybody, organizations and societies, to work together to make a better future for the people with disabilities.
Thank you, Mohammed. Dr. Grunke, can you tell us a little bit about the work you did with Learning Disabilities Worldwide?
Yeah, I certainly can. Hi, Daryl. Thanks for having me. Yeah, we've been focusing on bridging the gap between research and practice, because this is something that is really concerning to us. Like if you had a heart problem, a heart disease, and you went to a hospital, you would prefer the treatment of today over the treatment you would have gotten like 20, 30, 40 years ago. But with learning disabilities, it's different. So you don't get better treatment today than you got like a couple of decades ago. So, and the main reason for this is that the gap between research and practice remains exceptionally wide. So what we are trying to do is connect all stakeholders with each other and come up with interventions that are very easy to implement so that we can make a difference in the lives of people affected with learning disabilities.
Thank you, Dr. Grunke. Dr. Haggerty, please share with us the work you are doing with Beacon College and your work over the past few years to try to share Beacon's model with the world.
Well, Daryl, my history, both in special ed and higher ed, is fairly long. I started as a classroom teacher in 1975, and then I went on to do a postdoctoral fellowship with the U.S. Department of Education and ended up with the Office of Special Education Programs. At the time, we were putting together the regulations. We were fine-tuning the regulations for all of the disabling conditions, but particularly for learning disabilities. There's one thing that we did know about learning disabilities, was that it is a broad range in the diversity of the students who have the LD identification, and that some students could go on and be very successful in higher education. Fast forward 40 years, and I was privileged to become the president of Beacon College, the first institution that was devoted specifically to students with learning and attention issues. And we have, over the past 8 to 10 years, made significant progress in the quality of instruction that we have. We have a lot to teach American higher education, I believe. And I have a lot of remarkable colleagues who are passionate about our mission, and our student outcomes show that we do make a significant difference.
Thank you, Dr. Haggerty. And Peju, tell me a little bit about the work you're doing with the Pitanga Center.
Well, Pitanga Center actually started in 2012 in Angola. I'm actually not Angola, but I was in Angola working as a Senko with one of the schools. And I was invited by the government of Angola to set up a 16-week workshop to train some of the directors and teachers and teaching assistants on how to actually work with children in schools and how to differentiate their curriculum and some school programs. So we decided, I decided to set up Pitanga Center to bring a greater awareness to a lot of parents in Angola to understand that whilst the government was gearing towards special needs as being special educational needs, there is a difference. And at the time, Angola had a center for children with special needs, which covered the whole range of disabilities. And I guess in many ways, there was no real focus on the difference. And so Pitanga Center was set up to actually show that we wanted to receive children who were classified as being having learning disabilities as opposed to having a learning difficulty, in order to show the difference between the two and to bring awareness to the public on the difference between the two areas, as well as to understand that when a person or a child has what we call PMLD here in the UK, profound and multiple learning disabilities, they cannot be put together with children who just have learning difficulties which gear towards a specific area. And that was the real aim of opening Pitanga Center when we did. And today we try to train teachers when we are invited to different schools on ways to especially differentiate the curriculum and to train teachers on how to perhaps, maybe for want of a better word, talk with the children and to guide them along and to introduce individual education programs to those who specifically need them.
All right. Thank you so much for that. So I wanted to start this conversation with this little tidbit that our viewers might be surprised to learn that the term learning disabilities isn't a universally understood and accepted term. And so I was going to ask each of you to kind of define what learning disabilities means in your particular region where you live and where you work. And we'll start this conversation again with Mohammed.
Okay, let me tell you about something. It's translated in Arabic, learning disabilities, it's translated learning difficulties. And it's something that people take lightly, and cultural understanding of the term is that this kid have a few troubles, this person have a few troubles, but they don't understand the extent of the trouble. They don't give him the attention and empowerment they need. But legally, this term, by law, this term classifies the person as a person with disabilities. So there is a difference between legally and culturally accepted and known.
Okay. Dr. Grunke.
All right, we use a very broad definition. Like we look at learning disabilities as a limited ability to develop the skill, will, knowledge, and self-regulation that is necessary to succeed in school. So it's very school related, and the causes are secondary. So it doesn't matter if it's genetic or if it comes, or the root causes are related with socioeconomic deprivation. You might have an average IQ, but you don't have to do that. So our definition includes pretty much the definition that is used in the US as well as the definition that is used in the UK.
Thank you. Dr. Haggerty.
Well, the term learning disabilities was first coined. It's had many other names, but in the United States in 1962, when a researcher named Dr. Sam Kirk got together with a group of parents who were focused on LD, and they came up with the name of learning disability, and it became popularized. But in the United States, given that I was a regulator, and I think this is pretty consistent, we have a fairly defined definition of what a learning disability is, as opposed from ADHD and other learning and attention issues. And that is students who are diagnosed with dyslexia, dysgraphia, or dyscalculia. So it's a very defined group. But if I might say, none of these students, and we certainly have learned this at Beacon College, each student needs individualized attention because they are a mix of strengths, needs, ambitions, and it is very difficult to put a precise label on these students.
And Peju, share with us the distinctions in England and in Angola when it comes to the definition of learning disabilities.
Here in England, the terms are actually defined separately, depending on the area and the school. Learning disability, in broad terms here, is classified as any person who has a disability that hinders their progress in learning. Whereas a learning difficulty is more defined as anybody who has a specific difficulty, a learning difficulty in a specific area. But in Angola, it's completely different. The term learning disability and learning difficulty are not actually used. What is used is special educational needs, or best way to say it, what is known is special needs, in which case they do not really separate the difference between a person with special needs and a person with special educational needs. It's all a disability, irrespective.
All right. So just to clarify, for the purposes of this show, we're defining learning disabilities to mean individuals with normal to above average intelligence who have challenges with reading, writing, and mathematics. So Dr. Grunke, why has there developed this sort of Tower of Babel effect in that across different nations and cultures, it seems we're speaking different languages when it comes to defining what learning disabilities are?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think it has to do with, Dr. Haggerty was referring to Samuel Kirk in the US, and when that term came up, it was like a medical diagnosis, and the defect was in the person, and it was highly genetically determined. And it depends on the culture and the norms and the language and the political currents of a specific country. Like in Germany, we have a very complicated relationship to genetics. And because of our dark history during the Third Reich, so anything that implies that the defect is in the person, that's something Germans would not accept. Like I read this paper by Alison Foster, that came out a couple of years ago, and it's called The Genetics of Learning Disability. That's something that Germans would not accept. I mean, we don't, even though there's some merit to it. Of course, there is genetics that play a part in the development of a learning disability, but we put the emphasis because of our culture and of our history on the socioeconomic deprivation. So I think it has a lot to do with where a country is coming from, on what they emphasize. And I guess that's the answer to your question, if that made any sense.
It does indeed. Thank you. Given that there isn't a common definition of learning disabilities, I would imagine that there is a broad range too of the kinds of supports and the behavioral supports and instructional supports available for children. Can you each talk about a little bit of what is available for students who fit the criteria of learning disabled or learning with difficulties in your particular region and area that you serve? And again, we'll start with Mohammed.
Okay, let me tell you a bit about that. In the case of children, they have learning disability instructors at schools, and they are the ones who can determine that the kids, they make the test for the kids if they have learning disabilities or not. Some schools have better ways of detecting an early detection, and then moving to adulthood. So when a person is an adult, he have to get medical paper or a medical report that says that he has dyslexia. He has to go through some tests like an MRI test and electro mapping of the brain. Then the doctor would issue him a certificate or a medical report that he has dyslexia or ADHD or any other learning disabilities. Then he go to the ministry and have an official letter after applying for an evaluation. Then they will have an official letter from the government stating that they have a learning disability.
Great. Dr. Grunke, tell us about Germany because of the relationship you just described with genetics and that sort of thing. What kinds of interventions, differentiated education, and those types of things are available for students in Germany?
Yeah, we are moving towards inclusion, but we still have a system of special schools, and those came up as we wanted to make up for what we did wrong during the Third Reich, I guess. So we set up that big system of special schools where kids and youth received a lot of special attention, and we still have that system in place. On the other side, we also have a strong movement towards inclusion, where kids with disabilities are included in the mainstream school system. When they do that, when they are included in the mainstream school system, you have additional support by special educators, like they get 3 hours, 5 hours, 10 hours of special education support in addition to the normal schooling. So that's what we have. And we have that system, the response to intervention system, where you have different tiers where students receive a different amount of support. We are starting to implement that, and we are still trying to find the best way on how to attend to the needs of those students, because inclusion has its pros and cons. Special schools don't only have disadvantages, there are some pros to it, and we are still in the process of trying to figure out the best way.
Thank you. Dr. Haggerty.
Since the passage of what was called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act in 1975, we have had two legal principles, which are also educational principles. One is that every student, including those with learning disabilities, is entitled to a free and appropriate public education. And the second piece of this is that education should be provided in the least restrictive environment. That suggests that we go as far as we can with inclusion as opposed to pull-out services. What has happened over time is that we have realized that about 8 to 10% of our students fall into some area of learning difficulty, learning difference, learning disability, and that this is probably a larger population than the law originally provided for at the federal level. And so the in the end, we do have a broad range of procedural safeguards, including psychoeducational evaluations, early identification, alternative placements. But the one thing that we do focus on is on attempting to provide that education in the least restrictive environment. And that's not always the regular classroom or mainstreamed environment.
Dr. Haggerty, in your experience, how common is it for a child who has learning disabilities and who is living in a country where students are not identified and do not receive evidence-based interventions? Is that a pretty common thing?
Yes, I've had the privilege of living and working on 4 continents. And one thing that my wife and I do, my wife being a professional in this area also, is to try to visit as many schools as we can during either a visit to the country or when we're living there. And it's very clear that there's one major cultural barrier to whether effective policies are in place. And I would say that is how the culture stigmatizes a disability, whether it's a learning disability or ADHD, or whether it's an intellectual disability. There is some stigma in many countries with respect to a disability. And in that case, the services that are provided are less mainstream, if in fact they're provided. The other major issue is that in many countries, the class sizes are just too large for an appropriate mainstreaming effort within the country. And teachers, regular classroom teachers for those mainstreamed environments have very little preparation for serving students who have learning differences, learning difficulties. And those are the things that get in the way whenever we go into another country, and we're asked to speak overseas quite often. It is very clear that individuals are very hungry, particularly the parents, are very hungry for information on learning disabilities, because they realize, just like any other disability, if the learning disability isn't attended to, it can mean a lost or interrupted life for their child. And in many countries, what you see is that parents actually stepping out of their careers and putting together schools that are focused on learning disabilities, attention issues, emotional disturbance, autism. And so it really is where the government doesn't have the resources or the focus, parents do step in.
Thank you. So I'm curious about, and Dr. Grunke kind of touched on this earlier, I'm curious about mainstreaming. So I'm going to ask each of you to share what you've seen in your travels and in your work about mainstreaming. And we'll start again with Mohammed. How is mainstreaming something that we're seeing in Saudi Arabia when it comes to learning disabilities?
Well, these days, they're training more qualified instructors, and they are moving towards, we are already in the inclusion phase. Students with learning disabilities are already with normal students, and they're included in everyday life. But the missing piece, or the missing part here, is the other teachers. The other teachers sometimes don't understand how they can support their students that have learning disabilities, and also the parents, they don't know what to do, and they are not aware of the challenges. They are not fully aware of the challenges that the children and adults face.
Thank you. Dr. Grunke, I know you've written about this subject about learning disabilities around the world. What are you seeing as far as mainstreaming is concerned?
Yeah, it happens everywhere. It happens in Germany and other countries. But what is not happening to the extent that it needs to happen is what Mohammed just touched on. We need to prepare the teachers better, because it's not just mainstreaming. We have a lot of challenges when it comes to having children and youth with learning disabilities getting accepted by their peers. Like, we have studies that over 50% of those with learning disabilities experience severe rejection by their classmates, and a teacher needs to interject and come up with methods to combat that exclusion. Plus, I mean, those children a lot of times experience what is called a little fish, big pond effect, that they are together with classmates that are much better in reading, writing, and math, and they always feel really small in that big pond as little fish, and that can have a very detrimental effect on one's emotional and psychosomatic health. But we need to come up with solutions, and there are solutions that are available to help those students not feel so ostracized and not feel so, well, stupid in the company and in a class where everyone is performing much better. So mainstreaming is happening, but what is not happening is preparing the teachers to come up with, or preparing teachers to provide the services for those students that otherwise would feel marginalized or feel a lot left behind that there would need to be.
All right, thank you. Dr. Haggerty, our viewers might think that the United States is the gold standard when it comes to mainstreaming, but are we doing everything perfectly in that regard?
I think the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, and part of the flesh and bones are the resources that are required to really put in place a truly mainstreamed effort within the United States. Teacher preparation by our colleges of education at universities really need to focus as much time as they can on learning differences, because it is really the regular classroom teacher who is looking to serve students better, and in many cases many times has these students placed in their classrooms without sufficient support. Pull-out programs are absolutely necessary. That is for specialized services, and then they go back into the classroom. But that should be scaffolded out over time, and I'm afraid that we don't see that happening in many, many cases in the United States. So are we good at what we do? Yes. Are we very good at what we do? I'd pause on that one.
All right, thank you. Dr. Grunke, again, circling back to your experience writing about nations and around the world and how they approach this issue, are you seeing incremental and planned changes in nations so that they can better serve students with learning disabilities?
Yes and no. I mean, there's a lot of things happening on the side of evidence-based treatments and interventions. I can see a lot of things happening here. On the other side, I also see the problem of not having enough awareness for this population. I mean, 2/3 of our students with learning disabilities, and that is worldwide, are male. And in Germany, that proportion is even greater. We have a lot more males than females. And we don't have enough support for those. It's maybe not the thing to do. It's not hip to support young men. And so we should raise more awareness that those young people are suffering. So there's not enough happening in that respect. When it comes to having more and more evidence-based interventions available, I can see a big improvement, and things are looking a lot brighter and more hopeful today than, let's say, 10 or 15 years ago, because the number of evidence-based practices now has improved so much that we can say that there's hardly any student that we cannot help, any student that struggles with reading, writing, or mathematics, there is help readily available because of the broad and stable evidence base.
Great. So let me ask you this, and I'm going to stay with you for a moment, Dr. Grunke. We were discussing earlier about the lack of consensus when it comes around the definition of learning disabilities. And, you know,
Yes.
Our world is faced with so many complex and intractable problems like solving world peace, for instance, but coming up with a common definition for learning disabilities seems pretty cut and dried. Why hasn't it been done?
Yeah, that's a question that I asked myself many times. I think it would make things much easier. But at the same time, I mean, learning is acquiring a new understanding or knowledge or different skills. And you have to ask yourself, okay, what kind of skills and knowledge are we talking about? And that differs over time. Like when my dad learned to be a turner, the knowledge was much more valued than creativity. And most everyone back then learned an industrial trade, and manual skills were much more important yesterday than today. And so things shift. So we now have an emphasis on computation skills, communication skills, problem solving, critical thinking skills. And so depending on what you emphasize, learning, the definition of learning, or what's important to learn, the content, the skills, whatever, that shifts, and that depends also on the country. So it's very difficult to put that in a nutshell and boil that down to one single definition, because our society changes. A society within itself changes. What's important today was not as important 10, 20 years ago. And so, yeah, it's so much more complicated than if you defined whatever, ADHD or any physical impairment.
All right, thank you. I guess the final question for you today, panelists, is this. The greatest challenge, I think, when it comes to learning disabilities right now is what's next. And what's next as far as helping students become more included, to receive equity, and just to be more successful in their lives going forward, having abundant lives. From each of your vantage points, what's next in this movement? And we'll start with you, Mohammed.
I think that countries in the world and researchers should unite through one umbrella or through one entity around the world to bring all the research together and all the specialists and doctors and professors around the world together to open a discussion about this. After we can start this discussion, at least we can agree on the basic, that this is something neural or it is something genetic. We can agree at least on the basics, then we can move on. For example, we don't know what's going to happen in the next 20 or 30 or 100 years. What will happen to children with learning disabilities? Is it genetic? One day, will we devolve more the people that have this kind of genetics, if it's from genetics? Will it become more severe? And will they have one or more learning disability together with time? So we have to figure out these things soon. And we have to start bringing awareness, because in some areas of the world, they don't know anything about it. And sometimes when they know, they think that this person is lazy and they are mistreated and mislabeled with many different things. So stereotyping is also a problem. So countries should be able to get together and find solutions with experts and people who have these learning disabilities, and with the specialists also, like a trio. Together, I hope that we can find a better future for our children and the generations to come.
Thank you, Mohammed. Dr. Grunke.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Mohammed just said. I think we need a global initiative. We need to work together more closely. Like, you don't have that in psychotherapy or different fields of medicine, that countries work on a problem not well, looking at it as a something of a common interest, and getting together scientists, practitioners, policymakers from different countries. I think that is the crucial solution. Otherwise, we'll keep on doing the things that we do in a way that's not ideal, and will always be limited by our limited perspective that we have in our different countries.
Dr. Haggerty?
Yes. About 3 or 4 years ago, a great study was undertaken by the National Center for Learning Disabilities, and it was called Student Voices. And it was a comprehensive national study. And they asked students with learning differences what made a difference. And they identified 3 different types of students. There were navigators who did very well and made it on to even college and gainful employment, independence. Then there were copers who took, through sheer determination, made it to success. And then there were strugglers who really had a great difficulty in going beyond the horizon to either become copers or navigators. And there were features that were enormously important to the differentiation between whether they were copers or navigators or strugglers. And one certainly was the quality of the education they received. But there were also some other features. One was to have at least one adult who cared for them and showed them the future, and that was within the school district. A second one was that they felt that they were part of a larger community and could participate actively in the life of that community. And the last one was that they knew how to self-advocate, how to advocate for the services that they needed when things weren't going right, how to say they weren't going right, and how to work with teachers, how to work with service providers. And if we're really going to take a look at students who learn differently, then we are going to have to be more concerned with setting up an environment that recognizes the diversity of individuals, whether they're called learning disabled, whether they're called having a learning difficulty. Those kinds of things are far less important than the individualization of services, but you have to put the baseline in. If you take a look at legislation all around the world, policies, which I have, in many countries, they consider this learning disabilities to be a temporary situation. It is not. I am confident of that. There may be individuals who have learning issues, but not dyslexia. And so we really have to begin to come together and to come to a common understanding of not only what the learning issues are, but how we can best how we can best put environments together that attend to the individual issues that the students have.
Thank you. And finally, Peju.
I couldn't agree more with all the panelists, and especially with what Dr. Haggerty has just said. From where I'm coming from, I feel that really defining the differences makes a big difference, because we've got a lot of issues where, for example, globally, different countries perceive learning disability in a different way. But like Mohammed says, if everything came together under one umbrella properly and is well defined, then it makes it easier for anybody who's actually attending to the needs of each child to be able to understand exactly how to support them properly. I think my greatest problem with countries like Angola that generalize and put everything under one umbrella make it very difficult for the children or adults who are able to learn and are being lumped under that umbrella as having a disability, where they are not able to acquire any form of learning or are seen as having maybe very, very low intelligence, or deemed as being stupid or being just ordinarily naughty. And as Dr. Haggerty has put it quite nicely, the proper definition or redefining these areas would be one of the best ways forward, and more awareness. I guess more education generally would be good.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your perspectives on that. And I understand Mohammed had one closing remark.
Yes, I would like to say that, countries and businessmen and researchers around the world do not see the positive side. They're just seeing it as spending or something, to feel sad or sorry for people, and they're doing it out of charity. But look at the benefits. How many persons around the world, how many inventions around the world were invented by people with dyslexia? How did they change the world? You can see people with dyslexia around the world have really changed the world. So investing in dyslexia is investing in the future. So this is my message, and it's not only taking care or doing research, it's also looking at the positive side. What people with dyslexia can do, they can really change the world. If I could name 100 names, I could name them right now, but I would encourage people to search on the internet more, so they will have more awareness. Instead of me saying the names, they can discover it themselves. And I really hope that every person with dyslexia would shine and be empowered, and we hope to see them in the future as inventors, entrepreneurs, whatever they want to be, they can be.
Thank you for that, Mohammed. And we're going to leave the discussion right there. Mohammed Bahareth, Dr. Matthias Grunke, Dr. George J. Haggerty, and Peju Neme. Thank you for the insight.